Okay, good. I think we can get started then. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you joining us today, depending on where you're connecting from. It's great to have such a great crowd on the line. Very much looking forward to the coming hours of discussion and hearing about the results of this really interesting study. So, of course, my name is Anne-Herod Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Really delighted to be serving as the facilitator for today's event, today's webinar, the State of Humanitarian Professions, in which we're going to be learning more about the results of Bioforce's first international study on humanitarian professions. Again, it's great to see so many people here. We're looking forward to a dynamic and interesting discussion this morning. Some of you have been involved in the development of the study, and we will be following up with you on this morning's outcomes with an additional meeting this afternoon. So with that, we will turn to today's event. The capacities of those delivering response to humanitarian crises determine the quality of aid, its relevance, effectiveness, and sustainability, and is key to the effective application of humanitarian principles. But in a rapidly changing aid ecosystem, how can humanitarian organizations better recruit, retain, and develop competent staff? How can individual practitioners have greater clarity on how to enter the aid sector and be effective for people in need? How can learning providers better target the most acute learning needs? Those are some of the questions that the first international study on humanitarian professions, Bioforce's State of Humanitarian Professions 2020, attempts to answer. Today, we will be learning about the main results of this study in an interactive session together with Charlie Dalrymple, the lead consultant for the study, and Rory Downham, Bioforce's Director of Learning and Development. Many of you have also filled in a brief survey on the impact of COVID-19 on your professions, and we'll be hearing about the initial results of this as well in this session. After a short break, we'll then look at these results and their implications with a panel of experts who bring their perspectives from their respective organizations on the implications of these results on their work and on the humanitarian sector as a whole. And as mentioned, this is meant to be an interactive event, and your active participation is highly encouraged. So, of course, this should take place through the polls and exercises during the session, but also really by taking part in the discussion in real time using the chat on the left, and to submit any questions you have at any time during the day, again with the Ask Question box. Now, before we look at the results, I'd like to bring in two speakers who can provide us with some background on this study. First, I'd like to invite Gilles Collard, the Managing Director of Bioforce, to introduce the study and those who have contributed to it.
Dear participants, dear colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you to this conference, which will represent an important milestone in our collective understanding of professionalization of humanitarian sector. This conference and the State of Humanitarian report, which will be shared with you in a moment, would have never taken place without the extraordinary commitment of a number of persons that I want to sincerely thank now. First of all, I want to thank our partner and donor, the International Cooperation of Monaco. 4 years ago, Mrs. Benedict Schulz and her team accepted to support the opening of our regional training center in Dakar. It shows the importance Benedict gives to new initiatives in the humanitarian sector. She immediately agreed on supporting this first study on humanitarian profession because of reflections and innovations that this study will bring to the sector. I want to thank her now for her trust and her constant support. Then I want to sincerely thank Rory Downham, our Director of Learning and Development Department. He made this study concrete. Rory named and designed the scope of SOHP study and developed huge efforts for massive consultation and involvement of your organization all over the world which is a key element of its success. This gives me the opportunity to thank the member of the advisory group, Leigh Campbell of ALNAP, Gozel Balteava of CHS Alliance, Florence Donis of Humanity and Inclusion, James Mumm and Cecilia Roselli of NRC, Andrea Pink of ICRC, Geneviève Wills of WFP, Angarad Leng of PHAP, who volunteered their time and expertise, for which Bioforce is very grateful. I want to thank Charlie Dalrymple, the main author of this report, for his critical role and the operational coordination of this study. He was helped by Mirt Den Hoeden, who assisted him and managed the research part of the study. I want also to thank our Bioforce staff, who provided deep insight for this study, namely Brigitte Louison, our careers advisor, Guillaume, Magali, Pilar, Fred, and Mathieu from our Learning and Development Department, and Marie, Justine, and Lies from our Communication Department. They massively contributed to this event. Last but not least, I want to thank PHAP for the virtual hosting of this event. PHAP's network and expertise in organizing virtual events will surely contribute to the success of today's conference, and I thank them for that. Today we are going to share with you results of the first report on where we stand regarding humanitarian professions. It is also an opportunity for us to show how the human resources dimension is critical in our sector of intervention. It always has been, but it is too rarely considered as a core and common challenge. We hope that today we all realize how widely perceptions, changes, and evolutions of humanitarian professions are common across all professions and organizations. The humanitarian sector is evolving every day. The epidemic crisis we are facing now will certainly bring new dynamics and changes that will impact humanitarian response. Be sure that it will also influence the humanitarian professions of tomorrow. Through the result of this study on the state of humanitarian professions and the outcomes of today's conference, we'll gain a common understanding of what humanitarian professions look like and what competencies we need to face today's challenges. This is a first step, an important step forward that Bioforce has decided to promote. The outputs from this conference will definitely help us to better anticipate and manage the changing needs of the humanitarian sector through an increased effort on professionalization. Your participation and your recommendation will be critical to transform this first step into regular and continuous attention. I wish we have together a fruitful conference, and I thank you for your participation.
And I would also like to invite Benedict Schutz, Director of International Cooperation with the Government of Monaco, who funded this study, to say a few words about what she hopes the study can help achieve.
Good morning, dear friends and dear partners. First of all, I'm very happy to be there to welcome you for this conference, together with Bioforce and with Gilles Collard, that I thank for his kind words toward the cooperation of Monaco. We are a small corporation, but very, very committed, and we are very proud to be able to finance and support some pilot initiatives. So today we are very, very happy and proud to be, first of all, one of the very, very strong support of the Bioforce Dakar Center in Senegal, and then to be able to support this conference on the state of humanitarian profession. We deeply hope the discussions will help us to have some outcomes about our jobs and profession, and be able to think in a very, very new way about the ground we all stand for now and for the future in this very chaotic world. I deeply hope that in the outcomes of the studies, we'll have two things central in our point of view. First of all, the never-ending challenge of the gender issue. We need to really improve the professionalization of the female humanitarian and development staff. They need training, they need a better place, and it's going to be crucial in the future. Secondly, and we all know that in some ways, jobs like funds should be enrooted locally because the skills, the talents, the potential all exist locally. They just need to be developed, to be considered, and we need to tap this potential for a genuine sustainable development in the future. Finally, I would like to say that I'm really delighted to see how many of you are present today attending this conference. Despite the pandemic and all the change of plans, it most probably means that we all need some good questions and good answers. And it means also that we need some fruitful results and outcomes. And I can say by now that the Monegasque Corporation will support and fund for the future the outcomes of this conference. So I hope you have a very, very good day and a very good meeting together. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to turn to the study itself for a session looking at its main results. To lead us through this session, I'd like to introduce Rory Downham, Director of Learning and Development at Bioforce and in charge of the SOHP study. Welcome, Rory.
Thanks, Anne-Harriet, and hello to everyone. This has been a really exciting journey, and I'm so happy to be here with you today to share some of the results of our study.
Excellent. And also Charlie Dalrymple, the lead author of this study. Great to have you with us, Charlie.
Hi, Howard. Thanks for having me.
Okay, now over to you, Charlie. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. I think I can see 263 of you, which is fantastic. And I've seen lots of chats and lots of friends arriving in the chat, so it's great to see all of you. Our study started with an idea, and the idea was that the quality of humanitarian action really depends on the quality of its workforce. And in our view, that meant how professional the workforce was. So we started our study trying to ask a question, trying to understand whether humanitarian professions exist in their own right. That is to say that a humanitarian logistician, or the profession of humanitarian logistics, is different from any other sort of profession, any other sort of logistician, such as a commercial logistician or someone working in the health sector, for example. We first asked this question in an open forum over a year ago now at the HHR study in Antwerp in October 2019. Well, here we are more than a year later, thanks to COVID, and we have now 260 of you online. So I would like to ask this question again. So I would like to run a small poll to see your views on this question. So you have three options to choose from. Do you think humanitarian professions exist in their own right, as I've described, or is there no such thing as a humanitarian profession, just professions that are applied in the humanitarian sector? Or are you not sure? Go ahead and answer that now. It will take you 1 second, and we'll be able to see how you see the situation in the same way that our colleagues in the HHR sector event in October 2019 saw the situation. So results coming in fast now. And it seems that we're pushing towards a majority of people who believe that humanitarian professions do exist within their own right. But it's quite split. At least 2/3 of people around 2/3 feel that humanitarian professions exist in their own right, whereas around a quarter, no such thing as a humanitarian profession. It's just professions that are applied in the humanitarian sector. And around 8% of people are unsure, which is perfectly reasonable too. What was interesting is over time, as we got into the study, we realized the most important question wasn't, do humanitarian professions exist in their own right? But actually, the most important profession was, is the humanitarian workforce working professionally? So, to try to answer that question, we set about our study. And our study wanted to look at the different dimensions and different characteristics of work in the humanitarian sector, what we've called professions or profession areas. By doing that, we hoped that we could support professionalisation in the humanitarian sector, and we aimed our study at 3 different audience types. So individuals who are involved in humanitarian work or want to become involved in humanitarian work, humanitarian organisations who recruit, develop, retain, recognise and reward those people, and organisations who support both individual humanitarians and humanitarian organisations to learn and improve, organisations like Bioforce. There's quite a lot in the study. We found out quite a lot, more than I thought we would, to be honest. And I thought it would be useful to outline the contents of the study. I'm sure all of you have had access to it. If you haven't yet, you certainly can very soon. This is the main contents of the study. So we start looking at the humanitarian environment, trying to understand how the environment is affecting organisations and the staff they recruit. And it's worth noting that we started this study pre-COVID. We then tried to identify these profession areas, these areas of work that we've talked about, and we came up with 24 in total that Rory will talk to you about in a few moments. We looked at trends in recruitment, professional development, and career progression. And we tried to answer this question about humanitarian competencies. 2/3 of you just commented that you felt that humanitarian professions were distinct from other professions. And this is something that came up again and again in our study. So we wanted to know, are there competencies that define humanitarians that are distinguishable from the competencies that other people working in other sectors need? And then finally in the report, we looked in detail at each of those profession areas and we tried to understand to what extent is that profession area professionalized and to understand other characteristics about that profession area. So there's a large part of the report that is detailed information on each one of the professions. We didn't set out to complete an exhaustive study. We knew that wasn't possible, nor to provide definitive explanations of what's happening in the sector or why. Instead, what we wanted to do was we wanted to take a snapshot, and we wanted that snapshot to be defined by the experience, the views, and the opinions of humanitarians, people working in humanitarian action today. To get there, we got nearly 1,000 people working in humanitarian action, and with the 260 or so that are online today, we can add to that through your views, which I'll be asking for very shortly. So first we interviewed around 98 people across all of the 24 profession areas, and then we surveyed over 750 people. We took the results from both those interviews and the surveys, and we took them to 11 workshops in different locations around the world that you can see on the screen there, where 121 people are involved. I really want to say thank you to everyone who volunteered their time to be interviewed. There's a list in the report, and all those people who completed the survey. But I particularly want to thank a few organizations who hosted workshops for us, and they are City de la Solidarité in France, IMAP Colombia, Coast Trust in Bangladesh, ALNAP, CHS Alliance, TPO Uganda, Red Eye UK, HI, and Humentum. So thank you to everyone who was involved in those things. Before we get into the detail of the study, I need to explain a couple of definitions. We wanted to look at humanitarian professions, and we thought the best way to do that was to start with a humanitarian system, looking at humanitarian organizations that operate in that system, and then profession areas that exist within those organizations and functions, i.e. jobs that exist within those organizations. To make sure we were clear and to make sure people could understand what we were talking about, we wanted to use definitions that were well understood. So we turned to the fantastic State of Humanitarian System report from ALNAP, and we borrowed their definitions. So these are the definitions that we use for the humanitarian system and for humanitarian organizations. we fully recognise that there are important responders in the humanitarian sector who are not listed here. There's a lot of organisations that do not regard their primary mandate as humanitarian response, but are crucial in post-disaster situations. But for the sake of clarity, and to be able to work to a defined definition that was well known, this is what we chose. We went further to define humanitarian professions as functions employed by humanitarian organisations and which require competencies that are specific to humanitarian work. The second part of this sentence was important to us because we wanted to focus on professions such as WASH or logistics or project management in the humanitarian sector. We felt that roles such as a cleaner working in an NGO office or a security guard working in a UN compound, whilst crucial to humanitarian work, didn't require specific competencies for humanitarian work. One other definition that I should mention is around the terms sector, profession, and function. So when we talk with humanitarians, we find they say things such as humanitarian sector when relating it to the private sector, for example, but they also talk about WASH sector or nutrition sector. And so sector is used at these two different levels. For clarity, we specifically chose to use the term sector only to describe humanitarian sector, development sector, commercial sector, for example. And we talked about professions or profession areas to describe areas of work such as WASH, nutrition, logistics, etc. So, I said I wanted to get you involved. There are plenty of you out there, so let's get you involved straight away. If you haven't already answered the question in the lobby about what type of organisation you work for, please just take a second to answer it now. You're forming a part of our study sample now. You probably didn't know that when you signed up for this call, but you are now, so you're in and welcome. So please take a moment to just sign up and let us know what type of organisation you work for or have worked for most recently. And then when you've done that, what we'd also like to know is how much experience do you have in the humanitarian sector or in humanitarian work? So here's another poll. Do you have less than 2 years? 2 to 5 years, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20? Or are you an old hand who's got more than 20 years experience or perhaps even more than 30 years experience in this sector? So we've definitely got a mid-range there between 2 to I'd say around 25. We've got a few new people starting, which is great. We'll be asking you a question shortly. And we've got a lot of experienced people too. So even if we average 10 years experience, it looks like we may be slightly less than that. With nearly 300 participants, we've got somewhere in the region of 2,500 to 3,000 years worth of experience in the room today. So I'm delighted to have that and to harness it for our study. And with that, I'll hand over to Rory to take us forward.
Thanks, Charlie, and hello again to the now 274 people who have joined us. It's absolutely fantastic. Well, our first job when we launched this study was to identify the different humanitarian professions, or rather, profession areas as we chose to call them. Through an examination of humanitarian job boards, networks, rosters, and information sites, our study originally came up with a list of 28 humanitarian profession areas, which was used in the survey we ran and that Charlie just talked about. Later, after a review with the project advisory group, this list was further refined to our final list of 24 profession areas, which explains why the list of professions in our survey wasn't exactly the same as the final list presented in the results of our study. So here is our final list of 24 profession areas, as we called them. For the purpose of the study, we split them into functional and thematic professions. A thematic profession is related to a technical area of humanitarian work, like food, education, or health, whereas a functional profession is not specific to any area of intervention and supports activities across all or most of the areas. The key characteristics and trends for each of these 24 professions are presented in detail in the study. In our study, we interviewed a variety of key informants for each of the profession areas and to get to know each of those areas a lot better. Interestingly, one of our first surprises, and we had many, was the reaction of a number of these key informants who didn't seem to think of their area of work as a profession as such, or at least were not used to calling their area of work a profession. In our subsequent survey with humanitarian practitioners, we then asked people which profession areas they affiliated with. Before sharing the results, well, let's see what you think. Have a look at the list again, and we have a question for you on this poll, which is how many of these professions would you say that you personally would affiliate to? That is, how many of these profession areas represent the work you do in the humanitarian sector? So if you could just take a few seconds to fill in the poll. It's coming in very, very quick. Very interesting. We seem to have a slight majority of 3 at the moment. There seems to be a tendency between 2 and 3, or between 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, thank you for that. That's very interesting, because in our study, many contributors found it unusual to describe their work area as a profession, and when asked which profession areas they affiliated to, nearly half of all the survey respondents selected the maximum number they could, which was 5, as opposed to selecting just one specific profession area. And you can see this in the pie chart in the slide. What this seems to show, and that's supported by various elements of feedback during the study, is that humanitarian workers don't think of themselves as belonging to a specific profession area. There's a limited sense of profession. Perhaps the best way to illustrate this is at a party, when someone asks you, what do you do, or what's your job? If you worked for a commercial logistics firm like DHL or UPS, it's likely you'd say, I work in logistics, and unlikely you'd say, I work in the commercial sector. Yet, if you're a humanitarian logistician or a humanitarian wash engineer or protection specialist, you're probably more likely to say, I work in the humanitarian sector than I work in logistics. In our study, we then asked the respondents to select the one profession area that they affiliate most closely with. Before sharing the results, we'd like to know which one you would choose. So here we have another poll, and what we'd like you to do here is just to say, which one profession area do you most affiliate with? So we know that a lot of you have said that you affiliate with several professions, but here the question is, if you have to choose one which you most closely affiliate to, which one would it be? And the results are coming through. We seem to have 2 areas, human resource management and project management, which are equal at the moment. Very interesting. Some other tendencies coming through. Project management, interestingly, is just taking the lead. Well, that's really interesting. We have a slight advantage on project management and then human resources management for the moment. In our study, interestingly enough, the most commonly selected profession was project management. 24% of all respondents who answered that question in our study chose project management as the profession area they most closely affiliated with, which indicates a trend to generalization. Protection, logistics, health, wash and meal were the next highest, each accounting for between 6 and 8% of respondents. Project management is perhaps a reflection of professionalization in the humanitarian sector as a whole. It's widely undertaken and central to the success and effectiveness of humanitarian interventions. Many people have managed a project, yet very few have had training that extends beyond a short training course. Despite the best efforts of some great initiatives, even fewer people hold certification. Yet every year, we place billions of dollars in the hands of project managers for life-saving assistance and trust that they have the competencies to deliver good results. In conclusion, despite having identified the 24 profession areas, not only is there not a clear sense of profession with respect to these profession areas, but also these areas don't seem to be professionalized. I'm now going to hand back to Charlie to share our results on the professionalization part of the study, and we'll also be discussing this and other interesting topics in more detail later in the day. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Rory. I hope you can still see me okay. The sun is now streaming through my window here in London, and as it's sunshine in November in London, I'm not complaining. I'm just concerned that I might look half dark and half light, but you can hear me at least. So, professionalization is a very difficult thing to measure. In each of the 24 profession areas, we looked for 3 different aspects that might indicate professionalization, parts of the infrastructure of professionalization, you might say. I'll explain these briefly. So, we looked for competency frameworks. By competency frameworks, we mean sets of identified knowledge, skills, and behaviors required for an individual to undertake work in a particular work area. We also look for professional certifications, that is, learning programs that result in widely recognized certification that indicates that an individual does have the knowledge, skills, and behaviors necessary for that work. And finally, professional associations or professional bodies. So organizations where certified professionals and sometimes not certified professionals come together to share knowledge, develop standards, and assist each other. Our findings, as you can see from these charts, these donuts, were really interesting. So around a third of people felt that competency frameworks existed, and around a third of people felt that professional associations existed within their individual profession area. And half of people felt that professional certifications existed. This came as a big surprise to me, I have to say. Having been involved in the humanitarian sector for some time, I hadn't seen competency frameworks for many areas, and I haven't seen professional associations in many areas. What was interesting is when we asked our survey respondents to give us examples, these numbers started to fall away. Many people cited examples that weren't relevant to humanitarian work, so examples from the commercial sector or other areas. Some people gave us examples, for example, of individual competencies rather than competency frameworks. And some people gave us names of their own organization or NGOs or UN agencies when asked what professional associations were. In general, there was a distinct misunderstanding, and it really emphasized that the terms we were using here were not well understood amongst the humanitarians who were responding to our survey. Now, the fact that people don't understand jargon isn't a big problem, but perhaps a deeper problem is a lack of understanding of professionalization in general that might inhibit potential for discussion and action towards professionalization. As we looked at the 24 profession areas, they started to show some similarities or trends, if you like. And so in the most unscientific manner, and I must confess that now, I started to try to group them and had these discussions with Rory and other colleagues about how different professions had some similarities or differences. And we came up with these 5 groups. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we came up with a group that identified that some profession areas simply didn't identify themselves as a profession and had almost no or very little infrastructure related to professionalization. Typically, areas such as interagency coordination, really critical to the humanitarian sector, but everybody we spoke to at least told us that it wasn't a profession as such, it was just an area of work that took place. Diagonally across, on the top right-hand corner, you'll see humanitarian professions with existing infrastructure. And lots of well-established profession areas, particularly those that are thematic, such as protection, nutrition, education, have made distinct steps towards professionalisation. We identified a lot of work around competency frameworks and large numbers of communities of practice, although not identified professional bodies. The other three findings I think were a bit more interesting. So starting in the bottom right-hand corner, there are a number of established professions that really are so well established beyond the humanitarian sector that they don't really need professionalisation in the humanitarian sector. And these are areas such as health or legal, finance, where there exist strong professions outside of the humanitarian sector, so people enter humanitarian work and demonstrate their professionalism through certifications that are attained outside of humanitarian work. On the top centre, we see that newer profession areas seem to be somewhat quicker to professionalise. So areas such as cash and information management, although relatively new to the sector, seem to be making very fast and significant steps towards certification and identifying knowledge, skills and behaviours that were necessary for that work. And then on the top left-hand side, we saw some areas where we felt there was really significant opportunity, areas that were very well suited to professionalisation, such as project management, meal, donor relations and grant management, and also security. There's lots more about this in the report. Overall, what we saw was that the humanitarian sector as a whole hasn't taken on professionalisation in the way other sectors outside of humanitarian work have. And we think there are several reasons for this, but before we share those, or as they're shared in the report, we'd like to get your views. So we'd like you to just type 1 or maximum 2 words here and tell us, what do you think is the most important reason for the lack of professionalisation in humanitarian work? So I see that 2 answers have come up straight away. One around job uncertainty, cost. I guess that's the cost of professionalisation, but keep going. Try to just add in 1 or 2 words, and what we're going to do is collate all of these together, because we'll have a lot of answers hopefully, and create a word cloud that will try to give us an idea of which are the most popular answers here. I see cost is coming up a lot, so I expect that to happen. Constant change. It's interesting that someone's noted historical perspective. In some profession areas, we identified that clusters, for example, played a very significant role in a central coordination function, but weren't recognised as a professional association or body. And other organisations sometimes took that role on. In some areas, clusters played an important role and were regarded as the central point of coordination. So thanks for those answers. Keep them coming in. We hope to be able to turn those into a word cloud. So I'll be able to show you that very shortly. But I think what we'll do now is we'll move on to look at what we discovered was changing in individuals' roles. So I'll hand over to Rory to do that.
Thanks, Charlie. And thanks for all of those amazing suggestions. I'd just like to make a couple of quick points before moving on, just because that chat box is so dynamic. Number one, there are some extremely relevant comments there, and the nature of this conference today will not make it possible for us to get into a live discussion with 300 people on all of them, but we will be collating all of that information and using it. And there are also two or three or four very specific questions which have been repeated, and we will be trying at the end of this session to consider some of those questions. And the other thing is, I just wanted to point out, because as we're going through these presentations, I just wanted to clarify that what we're sharing here is just some examples for each of the areas of the study, and that there is a lot more detail on each of the subjects which you'll be able to access when we send you the study in a few weeks. So what's changing in your role? So another element of humanitarian professions which we decided we wanted to look into, which was essential, is what's changing in humanitarian professions, or what's changing in how humanitarians are working, which means that we wanted to look into what was changing in the environment of humanitarians and how that might be affecting the way humanitarians work and what they have to do and how they have to do it. So it's a little strange to look back at our data, which was collected before COVID-19 outbreak, and even try to remember the other changes that were happening. But let's give it a go, and I'd like to just pause and think about what was already changing for you before the COVID-19 outbreak. I'll just let you think about that, just so that we can try and remember what was already changing before this health crisis, which, as we'll see later, has had an enormous impact on how humanitarians work. So when we asked this question in our survey before the COVID-19 outbreak, 56% of all the respondents had experienced significant changes. Unsurprisingly, people with more experience in the humanitarian sector tended to notice these changes even more. As you can see in the chart, the two main types of change highlighted were: one, my role requires a very different set of skills and knowledge, and I interact with very different groups of people. And this we looked into further in the study, and to understand exactly what types of skills and knowledge were different and why humanitarians were having to interact with more and more varied groups of people. We took the results from our survey to workshops in different locations around the globe to better understand the specific nature of those changes. And by collating the reflections of those workshops and the contributions of the participants, we were able to come up with a list of the most commonly identified changes, which are here. So the most mentioned changes which came up in the survey, and then which were confirmed or added to in the 11 local workshops that we ran around the world, were the importance of being able to adapt to new technologies. Now this is a change that came through very, very strongly throughout our study. The importance or the impact of new technologies and the impact on how people work. Increasing use of cash, no surprise to anybody. Higher data literacy for humanitarian workers. Stricter donor requirements and the impact that has on how people work. More donor involvement in recruitment and meal, so monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Greater understanding across a range of work areas. So this is the need to understand how other areas work as well. Knowledge of climate change responses, more time spent on accountability to communities, and increased protection requirements. So my question to you now is, how does this list of changes resonate with you? So we're going to do a quick poll, and what we'd like you to do is just to select one of the answers on the poll to see how these changes resonate with you. Whether these are the changes that you also feel are impacting the way you work. And we've got lots of answers coming through with a strong preference for mostly. So it seems very much from your responses here that you recognize this list of changes and that they resonate with you. So that's great, and that's going to be very useful extra information for our study. Thank you very much. We also collected some data before the conference to see how COVID had affected professions and jobs. As our study had to be prolonged because of the COVID outbreak, we had the opportunity to see how we could also include in our study the results of the impact of COVID on how people work and what changes that might bring. So we designed a short survey and shared it with the same network that we used for our main survey and the participants of today's conference. 256 respondents completed the survey from a wide range of countries and professions, as you can see in the figures in the slide here. The survey shows some very interesting results. Firstly, the respondents reported changes in both the themes or the focus of their work and also the methods they adopted. By far the most significant change was in the methods. 74% of the respondents noted a considerable or complete change in the way they work. Most gave examples relating to work remotely, and adapting their programs to be implemented from a distance. For programs that continued in person, people noted having to adapt the program in accordance with infection prevention measures in mind. Several also talked about greater use of cash, replacing distributions of physical items. Respondents cited increased focus on hygiene promotion and palliative care. Some cited the need to respond to increasing and changing forms of GBV. More positively, others highlighted a growing area of innovation forced by the pandemic. As the methods and approaches are changing rapidly, it makes sense that the skill sets required of humanitarian workers also changes rapidly. More than 2 in 3 respondents felt that the skills required to do their job had increased. Specific examples included, not surprisingly, remote management, risk analysis, contingency planning, and remote monitoring of projects. Some suggested that local staff need support to enhance their skills and that expatriates need to focus on skills in capacity development, knowledge exchange, etc. Interestingly, 7% reported a decrease in skill set, some highlighting reduced need for community liaison skills as work was being done remotely. Nearly 2/3 of respondents also reported that the pandemic increased the need for professionalization in their work, which was another interesting finding that we had on the importance of professionalization today. And then, when asked how their individual profession area would need to adapt to respond to the threat of future virus outbreaks, respondents provided an interesting range of answers. So you can see on the slide here the different types of needs that the respondents identified in order to develop their capacity to respond to future virus outbreaks like COVID. And there are a number of examples which came out here, some very specific and some very general, like the need for localization, developing remote learning skills, investing in remote management technology and skills, and preparing mechanisms for remote communication with communities. So there is a very, very strong focus on developing skills to work remotely, and then other more specific skills relative to health crises. So on that, I'm going to hand back over to Charlie, who's going to take us through the results on recruitment. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Rory. I really enjoy this session. We need to do these more often. We're getting loads of extra results for the survey, which is fantastic. And I'm just completely absorbed by the chat box on the left-hand side. The debates that are taking place in there, I actually forgot what I was about to say next because I was looking at that, but I quickly remembered. So I'm going to talk to you about recruitment, professional development, and career progression. So let's start recruitment with a couple of questions. So I've got two very quick polls for you. So, do you have difficulty in recruiting and retaining suitably skilled people in your organization? Is it a difficult thing to do to get the right people with the right skills into your organization? And I know this is a bit of a silly question because every conversation I ever have with a humanitarian person who is involved in recruitment tells me the same answer, and I think we can see the results there that nearly 3/4 of people are saying, yes, we have difficulty doing that. So let me ask you another question. So here's a second poll. If you are new to the sector, and I said I'd call upon you newbies shortly, did you find it hard to break into this work? And this is another perennial conversation that I find myself having with especially people who are new to our sector, whether they're new because they've just come from study or whether they're new because they've come from a different sector and they're trying to arrive. And again, more than 2/3, around 70%, seem to be saying, yes, actually, I find it very difficult to break into this work. And these two things I think are quite common. There's no surprises here. But what it does tell us is that we have this strange imbalance. We have a lot of very talented people who are desperate to break into this work, but cannot. And we have a lot of organizations who are trying to recruit talented people and are struggling to get the right people in the right places. So we have demand and we have supply, but the two don't seem to be meeting. And we were very interested to understand why, and we think that our study might have indicated some reasons. So let's have a look. This chart, much to our surprise, would suggest that the supply and demand of skilled professionals is roughly in balance. What we did for this chart is we asked people to say that in their operating context, were they in a position where there were lots of job opportunities and not enough skilled professionals? Or were there lots of skilled professionals and not enough job opportunities? Or if the numbers were balanced, to respond in the middle. And what we see that overall, the situation is roughly balanced. And this raises two issues. One, it tells us, unsurprisingly, that recruitment is highly contextual. So it depends where you're operating, the organization you're working for, and which particular role you're recruiting for. But also, I think more fundamentally, it tells us that we have a matching problem in the sector. Supply and demand is roughly balanced. There is a huge amount of talent trying to get into the sector, and there is a huge amount of talent required in the sector. And yet somehow, that system, that structure is blocking, and we're not able to do it as well as we'd like to do. One of the other key findings that came out of the study incredibly strongly was the importance that we humanitarians place on humanitarian experience. The chart on the left indicates, well, both charts indicate, that humanitarian experience is regarded as the number one thing for employers and the hardest thing to get hold of. Employers actually put the number of years of humanitarian experience ahead of the requisite skill set for the job, which I was quite surprised to see. So this emphasis on humanitarian experience asks a couple more questions. It asks us, how can we justify someone coming into the sector? How can we, as that individual entering the sector who doesn't have humanitarian experience, how can you prove that you will be a good humanitarian? It creates a challenge for us to identify, are there specific competencies that humanitarians have because of their experience that people who don't have humanitarian experience don't have? And if so, how can we identify those? The other question it asks me is, does this relate to the challenge you identified earlier? If we have an imbalance, or if we have a need to try to bring more talent into the sector and we're struggling to do that, then how does that compare with the idea that we only want to recruit people if they've got humanitarian experience? And it raises a question for me about bias in our recruitment. perhaps an unfounded or perhaps founded and justified bias towards humanitarian experience. So what I'd like to do is ask you a quick question about what you see as the biggest challenge in humanitarian recruitment. And my mistake earlier, I apologise for saying we do a word cloud with the previous text. We weren't going to, but we will now, I promise. So if you could just type one word or two words and tell us what is the biggest problem you see, you experience in recruitment in the humanitarian sector. And just type that in. And as we gather those together, we will hopefully be able to create a word cloud. As you're doing that, I'm going to highlight some of the other challenges that our survey respondents, people in our study, identified. So I think some people have referenced this. A lot of people talked about a lack of diversity and a lack of bias, a distinct amount of bias and a lack of diversity, tending to recruit people who are like us. They also talked about localization being a positive thing in the sector, but they talked about slow localization and how long it was taking. They identified that localization was often happening because of financial reasons or because of access issues, as opposed to a drive to shift power to local actors. People identified the short-term nature of humanitarian recruitment, talking about a lot of contracts relating to just a few months at a time, and that creating difficulties for retaining talent and attracting talent when you're only offering short-term contracts. And finally, they talked about transparency that was really concerning, and a number of people in our study actually talked about nepotism and problems with humanitarian recruitment where people were recruiting friends, relatives, people they knew as opposed to those who were best for the job. So it looks like you've put a whole bunch of words in there. Some of you have gone a few more than one or two words, which makes it a little bit difficult for the word cloud, but we'll see what we can do. So I might ask my esteemed colleagues, if they're able to gather that stuff together and try to create a word cloud for it. We've got too many answers coming in. You're too keen, which is excellent. Let's see what comes out of this. Oh, I see Guillaume saying corruption, which is a big phrase. And nepotism comes in there. A lot of concerns about humanitarian recruitment. And a big topic, I think, that came out of our study, something we really need to discuss and try to solve, which was one of the things we wanted to do from this study. Let's see what Marcus has been able to create. There we go. So unsurprisingly, humanitarian came out a lot because I think a lot of people will have typed it. Experience, again, what was consistent with our study. Competence, connection, lack comes out a lot, but bias is an issue there. References is an issue. And of course the words recruitment and recruiting came up a lot. Okay, thank you very much again for your involvement in that. We really appreciate that. We'll be taking all the data away from today's experience. I'd like to talk a little bit now about professional development. So, much to our surprise, when we looked at the access opportunities for professional development, we looked both in terms of the type of organisation and by region, and we didn't identify any particular differences or significant differences that different organisations had different levels of access to professional development opportunities. When we looked by region, we saw a similar picture. Latin America seems to be very keen on providing capacity development opportunities, which is fantastic, but across the board we didn't see any particular differences. Now, this surprised us because Rory and I have worked in learning and development in the humanitarian sector for some time, and we know that there is a constant discussion which talks about particularly local staff of local and national NGOs not getting access to training opportunities they need. And we think this may be a challenge with the sample from our survey, or perhaps just a misunderstanding of the question. But what did come up in the survey, I think, that is consistent with our experiences, were that people also identified that whilst particular organisations were getting access to professional development opportunities, very often the individuals, the specific individuals who needed that training, were not getting it. Also, when capacity building opportunities and learning programs did reach people, the quality of those programs was sometimes questionable. And finally, and I think really significantly, especially in the context of COVID, people identified that those changes that Rory talked about were very important to them, and that the learning opportunities they were accessing were not keeping pace with the changes that were happening in their world. So they were not getting the right skills they needed to be able to move quickly enough to keep up with humanitarian work. When we asked people about future professional development opportunities and what would be most useful to them, we were again quite surprised to see that people referred in a large part to face-to-face experiences. So face-to-face training, they valued coaching, mentoring and workplace shadowing ahead of online learning, either as part of a group or individually. I think it's really important to remember that this survey was undertaken before the COVID outbreak, and I'm sure that if we ask people right now about the opportunities they need immediately, everything would be remote and based around virtual experiences. But this is what people said before. Finally, I'd like to look at career progression. We were interested in two aspects of career progression. Firstly, how long people intend to spend in the humanitarian sector, so longevity. And secondly, permanence, i.e., will they be in the humanitarian sector permanently, or will they spend some time involved in a response or working for a humanitarian organisation and then leave the sector to return to the sector, to leave the sector again and return to the sector? So let's ask you, first of all, let's find out your experiences. So first, let's look at how long you expect to work in the humanitarian sector for. Do you think you'll be here less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, more than 10 years, or perhaps your whole professional life? Seems we've got a very dedicated bunch of participants today, which is fantastic. Around 80%, I think, are expecting to be in the sector for more than 10 years. Maybe that's the results of reading this fabulous study and seeing our presentations. I doubt it. Okay, that's great, thank you. And now let me ask you the other question. So the other question is around how continuous do you expect your involvement to be? So do you expect to come and work in the sector for periods of less than a year before leaving and then coming back, or perhaps extended periods that are a little bit longer than a year? Or do you intend to work continuously for 5 years or more in the sector? And I think with the audience we have today, we see that there's a real tendency to working continuously in the sector for at least 5 years. So the results of our study showed something slightly different to what we've seen today, which is very interesting. So these two charts identify that around 50% of the people who responded to our study said that they saw themselves working in the humanitarian sector for 10 years or more, meaning that slightly less than 50% felt that they would be working in the sector for less than 10 years. What also was identified when we overlaid one on top of the other was that people who saw themselves working in the sector for less duration were more likely to see their involvement in the sector as transient. They were more likely to come in and out of the sector for shorter periods. This again raises 2 points. One, that perhaps this is a reflection that people do not see humanitarian work as a career choice. And perhaps that relates to our professionalisation. Is there value in professionalising and gaining certification in a particular area of humanitarian work if you don't believe you're going to work in that sector for more than 10 years? Also, it identifies perhaps a trend towards more transient careers and people moving in and out of work and in and out of sectors and working in lots of different areas throughout their career. This is fine, but it then raises again that question about our reliance on those with humanitarian experience. Because if we are trying to recruit only for people who have perhaps recent humanitarian experience, then we are going to struggle if we know that people are coming in and out of the sector quite a lot. What we also know is that every year in disaster-prone countries, there is a perennial movement of people who work in the commercial, development, government, social sectors into humanitarian response when needed, only to return to their substantive jobs afterwards. So we have some challenges in here, and a lot of this led us to this idea of what is so important about humanitarian and what can we identify as distinguishable for people coming into the humanitarian sector, the competencies that they need to be able to operate effectively in humanitarian work. And here I'll pass back to Rory to talk to you a little bit about what we found about humanitarian competencies.
Thanks, Charlie. And this is the last section of study, but a very substantial section and rich with findings. Our study, as you've been hearing, clearly indicates the value that humanitarians place on humanitarian experience. The question is, does that suggest that humanitarians are somehow different from everybody else? Do they have competencies, that is, knowledge, skills, and behaviors, that separate them from non-humanitarians? Well, that's what we really wanted to know, and that's what we tried to push for in our methodology for our study. The SOHP study didn't aim to duplicate the core humanitarian competency framework. We all know that there is a reference core competency framework out there, but instead try to identify competencies related to humanitarian work that might distinguish it from other sectors. So what competencies are different from similar professions in other sectors and across all the types of profession areas in the humanitarian sector? We thought that having this information, that identifying a list of distinguishable humanitarian competencies could be particularly useful for individuals who want to come into the sector and need to know which competencies they need to focus on to be an effective humanitarian. Important for humanitarian recruiters, who will then be able to know the likely gaps in competencies of potential candidates from outside the sector and how long it might take for them to get up to speed. Useful for NGOs and CSOs whose primary mandate is not humanitarian work, but who are often key responders, and as key responders need to know the additional competencies that their teams require in humanitarian settings. And finally, the value of humanitarian professions, separate from their private or public sector counterparts, can then be determined if we know what are the distinguishable competencies. So, to begin with, and to go on with the same pattern in this presentation, we're going to ask you. I'd like you to consider your own profession area, if you have one, in humanitarian work, and answer the simple question: do you believe that there are skills, knowledge, and behaviors required for your humanitarian profession that distinguish it from an equivalent non-humanitarian profession? For example, if you're a humanitarian logistician, do you think that you need knowledge, skills, and behaviors that would be different from a logistician working in another sector like the private sector? So, those results are coming in very quickly, with a very, very clear preference for yes. 85%, 84% of you are answering yes. There are skills, knowledge, and behaviors which are specifically required for your profession in the humanitarian sector. Thank you very much for that. That's really interesting. Well, let me share with you what we found in our survey. And yet again, it's corroborating. So in our survey, 82% of all the survey respondents felt that their humanitarian profession area was unique. 13%, or that it required competencies that distinguished it from equivalent non-humanitarian professions, 69%. So either by saying that their profession area was unique to humanitarian or that it needed specific distinguishable competencies, 82% of the respondents mentioned that there was something specific about the competencies needed for their humanitarian job. Now, there is a caveat here. One of the unexpected findings of our study was the limited understanding that some humanitarians seem to have of other sectors. When asked to identify distinguishable competencies, some people listed things that clearly could be required in other sectors, like being organized or looking for mutually beneficial solutions in partnerships. So we have to be a bit cautious about how we interpret these results, because some of it might be due to the respondents not having experience in other sectors or understanding the competencies needed in other sectors. But this is another topic for later on today. However, through interviews, survey responses and workshops, contributors identified and broadly agreed on knowledge, skills and also behaviors that made up distinguishable humanitarian competencies. And we were very happy to be able to come up with what we feel is a pretty robust list after the information we had through our interviews, through the survey, and enriched with the 11 local workshops around the world. Now, it's difficult to prove that all of these competencies are unique to humanitarian work. It's likely that in almost every case, a similar competency is required in some form of work in another sector. However, it's possible to describe this set of competencies as particularly important in humanitarian work and more likely to differ from competencies in other areas of work. What we hope is that this finding provides a useful area of focus for humanitarian organizations looking to develop the competencies of their staff, for non-humanitarian organizations considering how they may need to adapt to play an effective role in humanitarian work, and for individuals who are looking to become engaged or advance in humanitarian work. So we'd like to ask you another question here. Now that you've probably had time to look through this list a little bit, another poll, we'd like to know to what extent would this list be useful for your organization or for you as an individual? That is, for your organization, that is, could this list be useful for you in your recruitment, in your professional development, in your training, or as an organization, if you are delivering learning services, this could help you inform your offer, your curricula, or as an individual, how this might help you understand which competencies you need to develop. Well, I think Charlie will be very happy with this as well. It's nice to see that only 1% is saying not at all. That's very, very encouraging. And 2/3 of you saying to a great extent, and 1/3 to some extent. So that's really good to know. This is exactly what we thought. We thought it would be very useful to come up with a list of knowledge, skills, and behaviors which across the board in humanitarian professions seem to be specifically important competencies to work in all or some of humanitarian professions. So we've now come to the end of the presentation of the results. We hope you found these results as interesting as we have. There are an awful lot more in the SOHP report on those areas in more detail, but in other areas as well. And as well as for each of the 24 profession areas, a short presentation of the characteristics and the evolutions of those professions. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Rory and Charlie. And I'm pleased to say we do have a few minutes available now for some questions, and we've had a number of questions come in. So we will take advantage of the time now. I'd like to pose, this is first an anonymous question. I'll toss it over to you, Charlie. This goes back to some of your earlier remarks on the findings. So Anonymous writes, while I agree with you that most functions working in the humanitarian sector do not need specific skills to work in the humanitarian profession, don't you think that an important paradigm shift would be necessary, even, for example, for an accountant to be successful in the humanitarian sector? So is there something other than this concept of special professional skills, but isn't there a kind of paradigm shift that is particular to being successful working in the humanitarian sector, even for someone in perhaps a non-humanitarian profession such as accountancy? Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, and thank you whoever sent that question. It's a really great question, and it really was at the core of our study, to be honest. My straight answer, and I will put my hands up and I'll say, I don't know. I think there's two things that come from it. One is that we run the risk of not knowing as long as we allow, perhaps I believe from the results of our study, and it's a personal belief, but a degree of bias in recruitment on sticking with just people who've already had experience in humanitarian settings. So I think we run the risk of not knowing. But also, if there are differences, if there are distinct differences, if that paradigm shift that's talked about is needed, then surely we can define those. So if someone who's currently working as an accountant in an insurance company says, I would like to go and be a humanitarian person and help people, then how would they make that shift? And at the moment, one of the things that we believe is that it's very grey. It's not very clear at all. What are the competencies that they are lacking? What is it that they need? And how do they get those competencies to be able to go to a humanitarian organisation and say, look, I think I've got these now. And some of those may need to be tested in a field environment. Some of them may not be through certification or qualification or training. Some of them may require field experience. But to just say, well, no, you can't do this job because you don't have the requisite experience, I feel it's a little, and it doesn't quite answer the question for me. So the short answer to the direct question that the person asked was that I don't know the answer, but I think it's really important that we talk about it to try to find out what that gap is between an accountant not working in the humanitarian sector to a finance professional working in the humanitarian sector.
Great. Thanks a lot, Charlie. And now a couple of questions that I'd like to put over to you, Rory. And Rory, do feel free to also come in if you have any additional thoughts on the paradigm shift question. But let me throw out a couple of new ones here for you as well. So first is a question from Helen, who was wondering, so when you were looking at the number of professions that people felt affiliated with, Helen is wondering, did the number of professions affiliated with vary depending on whether those professions were functional or thematic? So was this something that you were able to look into, or did you notice any trends there? And then another question for you, Rory, that came up from a number of people, including Nordine, Shafkat, and others. They were wondering why trainer or instructor was not listed among the 24 professions, or say more broadly, capacity building. So was that considered to be encompassed in another area, or why was that not mentioned? Over to you, Rory, for those questions.
Thanks, Anna Howard, and thanks for all these amazing contributions. Just before I dive into those two questions, I've been looking through the chat, impossible to follow when you're presenting, and thanks, Anna Howard, so much for keeping an eye on it, and Marcus too. But there are an awful lot of comments expressing surprise. This is, I wouldn't have expected that, or I wouldn't have expected this, or things like that. And I'd just like to say that that's probably one of the richest elements in our study is you know what came through and what surprised us as well. And again, we haven't digested all of this to sort of spit out an absolute truth anywhere. The study is all about bringing together opinions within the sector and sharing them in a methodic way. So I just wanted to make that point, and there are an awful lot of revelations about certain assumptions around humanitarian professions and humanitarian competencies. Now, of course, I'm going to forget the two questions now. No, I'm not. The question about functional and thematic professions, and did they vary? I'm not absolutely sure I understand what's meant by did they vary. Let me just explain how we did this. First of all, in order to be able to do a state of humanitarian professions, we needed to decide where humanitarian professions are held. So to make a list of humanitarian professions, we need to know to decide who employs and who deploys. And this is why we did our scoping work, which Charlie explained, and we decided to be practical and pragmatic and objective, to use the LNAP definition of the humanitarian system, and to take the organizations within that definition of the humanitarian system, and then to look at, amongst those types or categories of organizations, what types of profession they employ and deploy. And doing that by looking at job boards and information sites and networks and rosters, etc., we came up with this list originally of 28 professions, which is just a reflection of what's out there, what job offers there are, what organograms look like, etc., across those categories of organizations. And originally we came up with 28, and then during the evolution of the study, with various feedback and then a review by the advisory group, we refined it. For example, originally we had a profession area which was called advocacy and communication, and the decision was to separate that into two profession areas. One was advocacy, one was communication, and then to distinguish two large categories of professions. One thematic, so which reflects typically what we call sectoral work, or at least specific areas of intervention, like health and WASH, etc. And then the functional types of profession, which are there to support the different areas of work, irrespective of the theme. So I don't know whether that answers the question.
Rory, can I jump in there and add
yeah,
something? Is that okay? Sorry to interrupt. I think Helen's question was around, did the number of professions that people affiliated with vary between thematic and functional? And I'm pleased to answer it, because it was something we did look into. We thought that what might happen is that someone might affiliate to a particular thematic profession and then multiple functional professions. So they might say, I'm a WASH professional, but I also affiliate with logistics, project management, monitoring and evaluation, and grant management, because I do a bit of all of those alongside my WASH. And that, to a certain extent, and I don't think statistically significant, and we haven't gone into that level of detail, but to a certain extent that is true. So you'd expect functional professions to be selected more than thematic professions. As for each thematic profession people were selecting various functional professions, and that was indeed true. So functional professions did seem to be selected more when asked what is the main profession area, or what are the profession areas you affiliate with, than the thematic ones.
Thanks, Charlie. And the other question about, which I saw on the chat, and I was hoping might come up, training, capacity building. Why hasn't that been identified as a profession? A few things, and Charlie might add to this as well. Number one, our scoping, which I just explained, didn't include academia as a category of humanitarian organizations. Number one. Number two, a lot of training roles will be in human resources, and that's clearly identified as a humanitarian profession. And finally, capacity building. Yes, it didn't come up as a humanitarian profession, interestingly, but it's come across very, very strongly as a competency, as an important competency, and a change in the way people work and new skills or knowledge in the sector.
Excellent. Thanks so much, both of you. Now I have for Charlie, I have a question that came up in the chat. So this was regarding certifications, and it was linked to your presentation of the findings, Charlie, regarding professional associations and the belief that they existed, awareness, and so on, professional associations and certifications. So the question was, what is actually the distinction between earning a certification or, say, learning credit from your own employer, an NGO or UN agency, versus earning a certification or being otherwise affiliated to an independent professional association? What is that distinction, and why might that be important? Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks. So I think it's, firstly, I should say that I think professional development opportunities, learning in the main is something that's really important. And it doesn't matter whether you're taking a 2-hour online course on your own or whether you're taking a 12-week course of study. I think what's important is that people are developing. But in terms of what's regarded as a certification, it's mostly around recognition. So I guess that's in two dimensions. So one is, how widely recognized is it? So if you were to take an internal training course within your organization that is only really known within your organization, whilst that's useful, it's not widely recognized across your profession area, although for some organizations their courses are very well known. And then the other aspect is around an agreed standard or an agreed level of quality. And you can imagine that a professional body or professional association would offer certification to an agreed level. So if you think of studying a language and you take a language exam, you can go and take a French exam in a school anywhere, and then you can take a French exam that is certified by an institution like, I don't know the name, Institut Français, I think, I don't know. And then you know that, or everybody knows that qualification relates to a certain level of study and applies to a certain number of competencies. And that's why those three elements that I talked about when we were looking at the professionalization tie together, because organizations come together and individuals come together to agree competencies and competency frameworks, and then certification is set at a level that everybody understands and widely recognized. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks so much. Yes, Charlie. I see that we've come to the hour. I'm going to take the liberty of going maybe 3-4 minutes over because we have so many questions that do want to take care of a few more before our break. And then just a note to everyone, we'll be moving on to a very exciting panel. So some of the questions coming in, for example, regarding recommendations for young people moving into the sector, those are the kinds of questions we can address in the context of the panel. So I hope that you'll be able to stay on for that after the break. But for right now, Charlie, a couple of more detailed questions for you regarding the analysis of the study results. Had a question from Anne wondering if there were any important differences that you saw in the analysis by gender. And then also a question from Laura, similar question, but asking about local versus expat staff, if there were any big differences that came out in people's responses to the questions. Over to you, Charlie.
Yeah, really good questions. And I saw Anne's question as it came into the chat, and I immediately had a sort of twist in my stomach, because it's something we would have loved to have looked at. And we have the raw data, but just we had so much data, and we had a limited amount of time and resources to go through it, that we didn't take a gender lens to the whole study. So we haven't looked through the whole study to look at the results to see if there is a specific difference between answers for people of different genders. So the answer is just honestly, we don't know there. I think it's I want to be careful here, but I think Bioforce is developed this study and got behind this study to be able to put this information into the sector, to allow the sector to benefit from it. And I think that there's real potential there to use the data that we do have and to go through it from a gender lens perspective, because we have details about people's gender at the outset. And then in terms of local and expat differences, we tried to certainly look at differences where we had respondents who were working for national organisations and international organisations, and I think I highlighted a couple of those. We were conscious that because of the way our survey went out, naturally, and this is written in the report in the methodology section, because it went out from a Northern European NGO to its networks, although influential globally, we're conscious that a lot of the responders to the survey are disproportionately from French-speaking countries, from the global north, from international organisations. And we think that if we could, and if we can, and if we will do this again, we definitely want to work a lot harder to try to make those survey numbers go from about 750 hopefully into the thousands, and include a lot more people who are national members of staff. So and this is something we can ask participants here about. So if you've seen this presentation and you think this is worthwhile, and you're involved in an organisation that has a good network of national organisations or organisations in a particular country, then we'd love your support to try to get our survey out more widely. So I'm afraid it's not a very conclusive answer on either of those questions, only to put our hands up and say we think this is real potential for learning in the future.
Great, thank you, Charlie.
Could I just
go
add
ahead,
something
Rory.
very, very quickly, and because Charlie's making an important point, and he was mentioning what Bioforce has been trying to achieve by launching this first State of Humanitarian Professions, and what it does is it raises an awful lot of issues, and I think what we've been trying to do is to put down on the table an exhaustive as possible vision of what humanitarian professions look like and how they might be changing and what the needs are, etc., as very much a starting point to launch what we hope will be various work streams in the coming years to focus on more specific aspects and a lot of the recommendations that will probably come up today.
Okay, thanks, Rory. We have time for one more question, Rory. This is to you, coming in from Amna. Amna is wondering, is the humanitarian sector balancing somehow technical competencies versus personal competencies? In your view, or perhaps coming out of this, the study or the background work for that, which do you think is more important? And importantly, is there a gap on one side or the other, technical or personal competencies, that is more limiting to the humanitarian response? I hope that makes sense. Over to you, Rory.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating question. I think I'd put that into a larger perspective first. I'd say that, yet again, what seems to be mostly considered is humanitarian experience. Now, what that means is something else. But very, very clearly what's come out of our study is that what is mostly considered in humanitarian recruitment is neither technical skills nor personal skills, but humanitarian experience. What I believe is that a lot of personal skills or attitudes are not necessarily considered enough. We've looked at this indirectly in our study. It's a lot easier, I think, to focus on technical skills when you're looking to recruit than it is to personal skills. And the question I think that we've been finding interesting is which of those will have the biggest impact on the quality of the work that you're delivering. And when we look at what's been happening in the recent years, the biggest pitfalls and the biggest failures in our system are probably not so much linked to a lack of technical skills, but more to a lack of personal skills, abuse of power, and other such things.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Rory, and thanks again, Charlie, for the presentations. Very interesting, and as we've seen, very engaging for all of the participants. It's been really terrific, as both Charlie and Rory have mentioned, to see the active debate going on in the chat. So thank you so much, all of you, for your active engagement there. And I would like to, again, mention there are many people as well watching the live stream and having a discussion there as well on YouTube, 40 or 50 people, I believe. So thanks so much to you as well for being a part of the discussion today. Now, to give everyone a chance to catch their breath, we're going to take a short break. We'll be coming back at 1:15, so a very short break indeed. Do leave the event open on your device. Just step away for a few minutes and then come back and rejoin us at 1:15 for a panel discussion looking at what it means for humanitarian organizations, the results from this study, Humanitarian Professions and Professionalisation. So looking forward to see you again in just a few minutes. Bye-bye. Okay, everyone, welcome back. We are going to leave up the poll asking what you found most interesting from the results of the SOHP study. We'll leave that up for a few minutes still so that we can gather a few more thoughts on that. Thanks so much to everyone who's already submitted their inputs there. Now, for our next segment, we'll be taking a wider look at the overall implications of the results of the State of Humanitarian Professions study to discuss what questions related to humanitarian professions and professionalization actually mean for humanitarian organizations. For this, we wanted to invite practitioners from different types of humanitarian organizations, and we're very happy to have with us speakers currently working with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, with NGOs, UN agencies, and also donors. We do have a few questions already prepared for our panelists, but we're also very keen for you all to play an active role in the discussion. So if you would like to ask a question, please do continue to submit those using the Ask a Question box so that we can incorporate those into the discussion over the coming hour. And I also encourage you to continue to share your perspectives on these questions in the chat as well. Now, to introduce our panel, very pleased to have with us Keiko Cornal, International Human Resources Manager with the French Red Cross. Welcome, Keiko.
Thank you. Very glad to be here and participate to this debate.
So glad you could join us. And Yves Aurent, Senior Humanitarian Advisor with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO of the UK Government. Welcome, Yves.
Thanks a lot. Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
Great to have you online. And Virginie Lefebvre, Program and Partnerships Coordinator with AMEL Association International. Welcome, Virginie.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be among you.
Great to have you with us. And last but not least, Boris Lasasi, HR Manager with UNICEF. Welcome, Boris.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great. Welcome all. So we'll get going with an initial question that I'll pose first to Keiko and then to Boris. And of course, anyone on the panel who'd like to come in on a question, if I don't come to you directly, just put a quick note in the speaker chat, which you should see on the right side of your screen, and we'll be sure to come to you as well. But first to Keiko, then to Boris. There are so many challenges facing humanitarian organizations at the moment. In this context, why does HR matter? Let's start with this big question. First to you, Keiko.
Well, that's a very good question. I would say that overall HR are essential, no matter the context, even though the context lately has been changing a lot. As HR is essential in order to be able to respond to emergencies, to support and implement ongoing operations to deliver assistance, and also to develop capacities. Let's say that it's needed to attract competent and qualified profiles, find the right human resources with the right competencies according to context and emergencies, retain also competencies, and lately within this movement environment, it is essential in order to support organizations to adapt, to respond to the rapid onset and multiplication of emergency crises. And we have been forced to find, create, reinforce alternative solutions so that the operations can keep ongoing. And of course, with the professionalization also of the humanitarian sector, the work for the HR section has become progressively much more important, and requesting also to go beyond just recruitment or staff logistics. It's also requiring strategic vision, closer coordination with the operations, and well, in that sense, there is a real need, let's say, to invest in HR to develop loyalty, of course, and workers' retention, but also stability in order to ensure quality implementation of operations.
Great. Thank you very much, Keiko. And let's turn to Boris on the same question. From your perspective, in the context of so many challenges facing humanitarian organizations, why does HR matter? Over to you, Boris.
I just join what my colleagues say, and it really matters because the skills of our humanitarian workforce determine the success of our program implementation. And HR more than ever matters because the landscape has drastically shifted, and we require creative ideas to cope with, the rapid development in the humanitarian field. For example, recruitment may not longer be the only way to bring capacity or additional capacity. We talk about upskilling today, reskilling, or repurposing of what we traditionally known as non-humanitarian talent. And those points are as important, and HR play a major role. And also, it requires from us in the HR field, when it comes to HR management, our role is crucial because we need to be versatile. We need to develop flexible policies and frameworks to attract, retain, but also motivate the diverse qualified workforce that we're trying to keep and bring into this world. That's really, from my view, some area that could highlight how crucial HR is becoming, in addition to what my colleague just said. Over.
Excellent. Thank you, Boris and Keiko, for helping us to set the ground here for the discussion. I'd like to now move more specifically into reflecting on the results of the study that we've just heard about. I know that that all of our panelists were as well listening to the presentation over the last hour and a half of the results. So I'd like to turn first to Virginie, then to Yves, to ask, so the study suggests that jobs and the demands on individuals are changing fast. As an organization, how are you experiencing this? And to the extent that you are experiencing these rapid changes, how do you see them being managed? What are the challenges there? So first to you, Virginie.
Thank you very much. So definitely it is changing fast. However, what we do see is that the competencies which we are valuing are not necessarily changing fast, because I think they are relevant. And among them, we can see the adaptability and the flexibility of both staff and volunteers. And I think that we always have to remind this as well whenever we are sharing with our donors and partners profile of staff who may not be the perfect fit at the technical level, but who would have the capacity to acquire those skills. And I think that this is one of the major changes I've been noticing over the past couple of years, is that more and more we are valuing staff who do not necessarily have on paper all the technical skills, but because they are local, because they have some other experiences, then we would be recruiting them. I also think it is crucial when we're talking about the current context. The COVID-19 definitely showed us that we need to have frontliners who are able to be deployed very quickly. And I also think that the Beirut blast response showed us here in Lebanon that we needed to have frontliners very quickly. So I would say, yes, there are new competencies, and at the same time, we still need the same general type of profile. So it's a yes and a no.
So we have a question that's come in from Anke, and I would like to pose this first to Boris. We spoke more generally about challenges facing humanitarian organizations, but of course, one of the big specific challenges, I think, on all of our minds this year is COVID-19. So I'd like to jump right into that with a question from Anke. So to Boris, how do you assess the impact of COVID on recruitment for humanitarian emergencies? And now and also going forward. Over to you, Boris.
I mean, it's with no doubt. And just to add that I am also here supported with one of my colleagues who is in attendees, that's Suleiman Henikoy, and he's based straight in Congo, and could also jump in with the chat and add some additional comments in terms of those type of questions. Well, so far it's been additional challenge as it is for most of us. But the most important challenge is that is being added to us from the human resources point of view is how do we continue recruiting or deploying staff with all the challenges facing by moving people into face-to-face or deploy someone on the ground. How do we maintain the same level of delivery by providing a workforce that is able to function, not only in terms of the work that they're doing, but you see the challenges such as remote management, for those who are not able to be there with their team, where the crisis do really need intervention, like we see right now in Lebanon, where the team continue delivery. The work has to continue, and we have to stay to deliver. So from a human resources point of view is how do we provide the framework to the managers who are managing those teams that continue the delivery? How do we find additional resources that can continue supporting? We've seen a lot of remote support, but interestingly, we also see a lot of requests coming from staff, calling staff to say, I am willing to be deployed. So how can we go beyond the whole barrier set by countries in terms of letting people in? How do we make sure that the team on the ground get basically gelled with new additional workforce that could help them continue delivery? Because there is a clear need of continue and stay to deliver state of mind from the humanitarian colleagues. And COVID appears to be one hurdle, but a hurdle that shouldn't be there. in order for us to deliver for those in need. This is a feeling that's been very strong. And for us in the human resources is really how do we give the framework to those workers for them to be in the right state of mind, to feel comfortable, and also to feel supported while being virtually or on the ground whenever we can, and to continue the support. So the challenge is really into how do we maintain a certain normality in a foundation to colleagues and to staff working while nothing is normal, for them to continue in the right frame of work. So this is really the bigger challenge. I can summarize again into giving the right framework to our colleagues, to the staff, to the people who are deployed or ready to deploy, for them to continue delivery, because the need hasn't changed. In fact, it has increased. And this is really the biggest challenge that we are seeing. We are also seeing right now, in anticipation of some of the budgetary constraints, in how do we continue doing already more with what we have at hand, by anticipating not to increase in terms of number as we usually do when there is an onset. We usually deploy more. So right now is how do we deploy what is needed without overdue in order to maintain the consistency over the cycle of those responses. And I'll stop here first to see how my other colleague bring in their views as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Boris. I'd like to turn now to Keiko. So, Keiko, I wonder if you yourself have any thoughts on the same question regarding the impact of COVID on recruitment. But I'd like to throw another question your way as well. This is submitted just now by Kyo, who's asking what is the status of localization and nationalization in the context of humanitarian recruitment? So a couple of recruitment related questions for you. Over to you, Keiko.
Well, thanks. I think everything is kind of related. I do agree with Boris on the challenges that we have been facing with the COVID crisis lately, but the COVID crisis just kind of highlighted some issues that we have been facing for the past years somehow. And the main thing is that this has been forced us to be more creative, to be more agile, to rapidly adapt somehow in order to respond to these emergencies, and which also meant to diversify how we're working on the HR perspective, on recruitment, but also on retention. As I think, for example, HR cooperation with other actors has been one important focus that we have learned from this year, and then localization. Let's say that this last year has confirmed the need to be more focused on localization, to invest more in nationalization of position and roles, in career development, capacity development of our local staff, and much more than moving around, let's say, only international staff. This was, I have a problem. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well, Keiko.
Okay, I'm sorry. So yeah, in that sense, that has been impacting our recruitment modes, sources also, and focus much more on local partnerships, HR partnerships actually among actors, and of course the need to invest much more in local human resources and their capacity development.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Keiko. I'd like to now try again, turning to Yves, and I hope the connection works. Apologies, Yves, that we weren't able to hear your response last time. So let's go back to that question that I had posed before regarding the changing jobs, changing demands on individuals. To what extent you're experiencing this, or your organization, or the organizations you engage with, and how that's being managed. And then if I could, Yves, tack onto that, because I'd like to get into really the meat of what we're discussing, reacting to the study today. I'll tack on then the question, what is the value in identifying individual professions and distinguishable competencies? So there's a big chunk there. Over to you, Yves, and fingers crossed for the audio.
Yeah, I hope it works. I'm trying to start another device in the meantime. In terms of changes, what I was saying is that there are two types. Some are to do with the complexity of the operations we run now compared to the past, due to new technology, new approaches, development of science. Other changes are to do more with changes in the environment we operate in, where today compared to the past, acceptance is not necessarily to be taken for granted. Humanitarian access is more difficult to obtain in many contexts. So we definitely have two types of changes to manage, and some are more of a kind of technical nature, and others are perhaps a bit more of a political nature, is what I would say. I think this study that was presented is very rich. It provides a lot of information. And there's definitely value in identifying professions and competencies for several reasons. One of the reasons for that is that we can see that people are moving across organizations now. So we don't necessarily have a situation where people join an organization and then stay until they retire in the same organization. People move around quite a lot. And therefore, as a sector, we need to try to identify what we have in common, and we need to start working together on classifying this profession, classifying these competencies, and also making sure that we have common initiative to train people. We can no longer look at organizations in silo. The world doesn't work like this. It maybe did in the past, but it's no longer the case. Looking at the study, what I thought was interesting is that what we have in common with the current framework my organization is currently using seems to be about the knowledge and skills on the behaviors identified. That seems to be something that is across the board. I think when it comes to the more specific technical competencies, there are certainly common elements, but there are also differences across organizations. Over.
Thank you, Yves. Virginie, I'd like to turn to you now on this question of what is the value in identifying individual professions and distinguishable competencies for humanitarians. Over to you, Virginie.
Thank you very much. So definitely there is a value. I think that it's from an international management perspective, it impacts our capacity building and recruitment approaches, because if we have a set of distinguishable competencies, we're able to adapt. But I would turn it also in another way, is that sometimes we do identify those needed competencies, but we do see that the programs are not adapted and the partnerships are not adapted. This is often the case as well with our international partners. So it can also mean to adapt your program to the available competencies while you're building the capacity. What I do also see, and I like to focus on this point as well, is that some of the competencies would be more valued than others. We did recently, with the local NGOs Forum in Lebanon, completed a training needs assessment, and we do saw that many competencies related to fundraising and monitoring and evaluation were much more valued than others. And we did realize as well that there's work to be done to show that all those competencies are very important. And if I may, I'd just like to go back on the COVID question, because for me there's a very important challenge we're facing right now as well, is that most of our staff who are engaged with the COVID-19 response face a lot of stigma. And we do find that it is challenging to recruit healthcare workers sometimes because they are being perceived as more exposed to COVID-19, particularly those working with populations who are already very much stigmatized, such as a refugee population in Lebanon. So I think that this is also something to be taken into consideration when it comes to the evolving environment related to COVID-19.
Right. Thank you very much, Virginie. Now we have a very interesting question that's come in from Helen, and let's see. I'll pose this. I'll pose this first to Keiko, but anyone else who'd like to come in, please just let me know in the chat. So to Keiko, are there any reflections? Maybe from she writes from this study, but from your understanding of the study or otherwise from your work, Keiko, that demonstrate what shifts organizations may need to make in the capabilities held locally versus in global or HQ roles. So is there any kind of split that you're seeing between capabilities that should be held locally versus in global or HQ roles, and what this might mean for career path changes in different localities, local program, regional or global roles, and the skills, knowledge, and attitudes that people need to develop. Do you see any distinction like that that's important? Over to you, Keiko.
Well, it's a broad question, actually. Definitely, there is a need for a shift today, and a need for focusing much more on regionalization and localization. And somehow, like, this is a huge change that has been pending and because it's not new. It has been pending and it needs to be accelerated right now. That means also decentralize a bit more and focus much more on local and regional competencies that we can find. But this also means on an HR perspective to be able to enhance career development, capacity development, internally speaking also within our own organization.
Thanks a lot, Keiko. And a follow-up to you, going back to that question that I posed both to Yves and Virginie, what do you see as the value in identifying individual professions and distinguishable competencies for humanitarians? Back to you.
Well, I do think it's valuable in the sense of having a better understanding between profiles that are requested versus expected. It also has a proper impact on facilitation of recruitment, identifying the different levels in terms of training and personalized support that each organization needs to invest on. Each organization has also to assure timely and effective training to fill in the gaps that actually can be shown through the competencies, humanitarian competencies framework.
Thanks, Keiko. Now moving over to you, Boris. So first, let me ask you the same question about the value in identifying individual professions and distinguishable competencies for humanitarians. And when you're finished, I'm going to follow up. I have another specific question for you. So over to you, Boris.
Thank you. I mean, from what my colleagues have already said, to me, the value is really allowing us to set, the foundation for possible career paths, progression inside, but also outside the humanitarian world, if you look at the career path. So this is really, for me, the key value added. One way or the other, it will help us to manage the workforce inside and outside the humanitarian world. Over.
Great, thanks, Boris. And a follow-up question. We've got an interesting discussion going on in the chat, and Laura is also posing a question here, which I'd like to ask you to respond to. She writes, during the recruitment process of a consultant, what makes you choose an expat versus a local consultant? And she wonders, is there a dimension of there being a lack of trust or credibility regarding local organizations or local individuals that might push an organization to choose an expat consultant instead of a local consultant? Over to you, Boris.
Certainly from our practices and the way I've seen it from our organization, it's really case by case, and whether international or local is, in our case, is really set by the specific need and the specific country, but also the availability of skills and competencies in the particular setting. Or the need, and also sometimes requirement from donor perspective, and where the person need to be. Those elements are, to my experience, are more important in deciding whether on a local or international. It's really not about, to my view, at least in most of the cases, not about the trust. It is really more about the context of the role, the responsibility, the need that, and then also the market available on the country where we are operating. Over.
Thank you, Boris. Turning to Virginie, we have another question that's come in. This is from Brian, and he's referring to this issue of more generalist humanitarians versus more specialist workers, and asking, are we actually expecting too many competencies from each individual and not sufficiently valuing specific expertise or specializations? And he brings in the example, he says, from in the health sector, we would not expect dentists to also serve as midwives. So how can we expect so much from each individual in the humanitarian sector? Do you have any reflections on this, Virginie?
My first reflection would be that beyond the competencies, and I agree that you cannot expect all dentists to know, for instance, the project management cycle, but I think that what we need to expect from our humanitarian worker colleagues is a very in-depth commitment to humanitarian values. And I think that this is more the issue than having all set of competencies. We've been talking before about individuals coming from the private sector. Here in Lebanon, with the Beirut blast response, we saw a strong mobilization of volunteers, which was really amazing. And at the same time, not all of them had the same commitment and knowledge of humanitarian values. And I would say that this would be more the issue than having certain competencies, which are described in the report, which definitely do not need to be acquired by all the other staff. I think another issue we have, because we're talking a lot about recruitment, but another issue we have is this lack of understanding from all our team members of what the others are doing as well, and to value as well the fact that the dentist will have other competencies and do not necessarily need to have all the other competencies. So this knowledge of the competencies would go way beyond the recruitment process. It also needs to be reflected into your internal human resources policies.
Right. Thanks, Virginie. Now, I'd like to refocus again on the study and go around the panel to ask, have any of the findings that we heard about today surprised you? You're all very experienced in this area in your respective organizations. What came out of the study that surprised you, if anything? We'll start with Yves. Over to you, Yves.
I read the study. I have to admit I was distracted slightly during the presentation this morning by the conflict in Ethiopia, but I read the report. I didn't find much surprising. I think it's fairly aligned with our current thinking. There is one thematic area that I thought was surprising and does not really appear much. It's a language skill issue on the communication skill matters. Our experience is that we seem to find a huge difference in terms of English-speaking world and French-speaking world. And of course, the world is more complex and there are many more languages to consider. So I was surprised that did not appear a lot more. But generally speaking, it's aligned with our thinking. The other slight surprise is the cash and voucher being seen as a functional profession. I think we would consider this perhaps more as what you classify as a thematic profession rather than actually a functional one. But that's probably more a detail. Generally speaking, we didn't find anything particularly surprising or we would disagree with. Over.
Thanks, Yves. Turning to Keiko, what, if anything, surprised you from the study?
Well, as Yves said, most of the findings are in line with our own observations for the past years. However, this study has a credit to highlight, consolidate and structure all the findings and observation that each organization has been actually experiencing during the past years. And it highlights actually also how complex the humanitarian sector can be. And but then I will join also Yves. I was kind of surprised to don't see mention much more teamwork, communication skills, strategic thinking that are for me some few let's say concepts that are very linked to our environment today.
Thanks, Keiko. And Boris, any surprises for you coming out of the study?
Just like Keiko and Yves say, not really. It is pretty close to what we observe. And just like my colleagues also say, there are other points that I would have liked to see a little bit more. I would have loved to see a little bit more on duty of care, a little bit to focus on the well-being part. I would have loved to see also in terms of competencies, specific competencies around managerial, like coaching, conflict resolution, for those who manage team in these contests. Another thing that I felt like, it would have been good to see a little bit the differentiation is really if the competencies we see were linked to the cycle of emergencies, meaning are we at the onset? Do we need the exact same competencies at the onset than in a protracted emergency that's been there for some time? I'm talking about organization where we have, when there's a response and it's onset, we need certain things and it will be super fast. But we do have emergencies that have been there for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, and we're still, responding. It's complex. So in those cases, do you constantly maintain the same competencies? For example, is that the same thing that we need? It was interesting to see that it was linked to a short-term contract. So in an organization like ours, we don't have so many short-term contracts per se, depending how we define the short-term contract. So this is really something that I would have loved to see a little bit more over.
Thank you, Boris. And Virginie, any thoughts from you regarding surprises that may have come out of this study from your perspective? Over to you.
The same as other colleagues, obviously most of the findings which were there in the report were related to things that we're noticing, but with this real added value of having everything in writing and thinking that, okay, you're not alone in your own world, and you do see lots of things which are shared with other individuals. One thing which I wouldn't say surprised me, but I was a bit disappointed when I read this, is the very high percentage of individuals saying that they were not projecting themselves for such a long duration of time in the humanitarian sector. And then I thought this means that we're doing something wrong, because this work is so amazing. Why would someone say, I'm going to work in the private sector? That's quite strange for me. So I thought that maybe there's something there around gender as well. We've been talking it, and Benedict in her introduction speech has been highlighting as well the importance of having specific pathways to mentor women when it comes to capacity development. And I think that there we are really and still doing not much better than the private sector, in fact, in terms of our practices. So I think that there is something there as well in terms of retaining the workforce and the volunteers on the long run. I was surprised that we're still not able to do better for this.
That's very interesting, Virginie. Thank you for that. I'd like to pick up on that point and ask the others. Yves, I'll turn to you first. What is your perspective on this problem that Virginie saw coming out of the study, perhaps not as a surprise, but about retention? Is this something that you see in your practice? So what do you think could be the cause? What could be done to address it? Over to you, Yves.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an important point. I seem to remember that a while ago, ICRC analyzed that, and if I remember well, several elements came out. On one of these is that the age of the workforce has changed also over time. In the past, we had a little bit more of the extremes with very, very young people, young professionals starting, and then we had people who were end of career working in the sector. Well, what we have right now is a wider range, but we are still not managing to retain everybody. The gender aspect, I think, is absolutely essential, and we do still have an issue with this. We still don't see workforce that are sufficiently balanced. And it's not a number game. It's also to look at the responsibility level people have in organizations, and we can certainly make progress when it comes to this. How to address the issue is probably complex, and I wouldn't know the answer, but I think acknowledging that there is an issue is probably a first start, a good start.
Right, thanks, Yves. Keiko, do you have any thoughts on this retention issue? Over to you.
Retention is definitely a huge HR issue today, as we see humanitarian workers going from organization to organization, staying longer also within the sector, or moving from this sector to another and then coming back. So definitely there is a real issue concerning competencies retention within an organization and within this sector. This is, on our HR perspective, very linked also to the multiplication of emergencies, the duration of funding, which also leads to much short-term contracts, and in that case, less possibility on my HR perspective, once again, to retain and provide more long-term contracts to humanitarian workers. It also refers, in our opinion, to job conditions that we can offer to our humanitarian workers.
Thanks, Keiko. And Boris, do you have anything that you can share with us, your thoughts on the retention problem that's been discussed? Over to you.
Can you hear me? Yes. I mean, from my perspective, it is as an interesting contest for an organization such as UNICEF, because we do have both world, development and humanitarian. So there is over time, we really try to actually not to have staff staying too long in the humanitarian or staff staying only in the non-humanitarian. So to create that balance, we have a deliberate approach trying to motivate staff to grow out of the humanitarian circle in order to expand their reach, in order to have a career path within the bigger organization. So overall, we try to retain staff within the organization, and one of the strategy is to allow staff to move from humanitarian to non-humanitarian and back and forth and vice versa. So this is kind of a different way to view. However, when it comes to certain skills, as we see that there's some new skills that's been developed. Sometimes we just don't have those skills internal. So if we bring in a new workforce, it is very important how we kind of work and retain those workforce. The other point I wanted to make is like, in general, we also see kind of there's new aspiration from maybe a different workforce or maybe different generations. I'm not sure, but we have like the requirement of some workforce now is about work-life balance, better living conditions, quick promotion, and also having a manager that constantly gives them feedback. This is coming from a certain generation of work. So it's about the whole package that we should offer to a certain workforce. And sometimes humanitarian organizations don't have the luxury to actually give all these, I would say, living conditions, because it's all about the reason also that you join and the cause. And sometimes the living condition comes with it. And the quick promotion may not also be there all the time. So all these things, it brings us now to think about how do we become creative to retain a certain part of the workforce within it. So this is a really, and now COVID has just made everything even faster, because we have to be, as Keiko said at the beginning, we have to be even more creative in how we give this, the whole package and the value of proposition to our staff and talents. Certainly, those are the points that I would like to just add. So there's a new workforce there. There's some new demand. People are looking for new dimensions, and the question is, how can we, as a humanitarian organization, offer this in order to attract people that we would not usually attract and retain them. Over.
Great, thank you very much, Boris. Now I have a set of three related questions I've compiled from a number of queries that have come in. I'm going to pose these all around the panel as well, and then that should bring us close to the end of our time, so then we'll have just some closing remarks before we finish. But this set of three questions, so they're different and yet related, so feel free to take just one, focus on one, or take all three, and I'll pose these first to Virginie. So the first is, from your perspective, what do you see as the top skills generally required now from those working in the humanitarian sector? The person asking the question is specifically asking about soft skills, but can think about skills more broadly. Second part, how do you see the humanitarian sector developing in the future? Do you see it expanding? Will it be growing? Will the kinds of skills be changing? And I know these are big questions, so take whichever part you like. And then the third, related to the above, how would you advise people who are entering the sector now to position themselves thinking about that future? So this is the first to you, Virginie. Sorry, it's a big question, but feel free to take some part of it. Over to you.
So I'll talk from a local NGO perspective here. It's not top fill requirements. It's just something I'm seeing from foreigners who are applying to local NGOs, which is something we do value as well, because sometimes there is an experience in another context which is valuable. But I think that really, if you're applying for a job in a country where you do not speak the language, it is a big barrier. And this is why I often feel so frustrated seeing expats coming into our country, Lebanon, who do not speak a word of Arabic and who have absolutely no previous experience in such countries. I know that there are certain and some very specific technical skills where this might not be important, but I think that in general, we're not at this stage anymore to recruit staff who do not have those skills. So I would really focus on this. And this would be related as well to my advice. Yes, for sure. If you're entering into a humanitarian sector related profession, it's good to have the technical skills. It's good to take training. But I'm always advising them to have a good general background before, not to go into the specific training too quickly, to have this general background. Why? Because this is how you'll get to the understanding of the context in which you are working. You might be the best logistician in theory, but if you do not understand the context in which you are working, then at the end, the impact of your work is not going to be as good as if you had this general understanding. Just a couple of words on the evolution of the humanitarian sector. I think it's a big question mark, but I don't see this humanitarian sector definitely as a shrinking sector, given the very high number of crises we're facing. What I do see in terms of trends, and I want to see it happening more and more, is definitely localization. But be careful, it shouldn't be cheap localization. It should be localization for the good reasons, particularly when it comes to human resources. And what I do see as trends as well is more and more, it's not only anymore about humanitarian, right? It's about humanitarian and development. I think that the whole debate around the nexus is important to have, but at the field level, this siloed approach in terms of implementation does not exist anymore. What is the impact in terms of human resources? We value increasingly people who have experience in both types of programs because they are able very quickly to catch up when it comes to protracted crises and to implement very quickly different types of programs, moving to early recovery and then to some more developmental approach.
Great. Thank you so much, Virginie. Let me turn now to Boris for the same set of 3 questions. Over to you, Boris.
Thank you. I think for me, what is going to influence the humanitarian workforce will, for me, beside COVID, is really this big push to diversify the workforce. More women, and also more ethnicity and diversity. Like in some countries, we're talking about less of West European per se, if I may put it that way, or we are looking for more program country in the area of where we actually responded. We talk about giving more chance to national staff for some countries, from different countries to rise to the overall humanitarian workforce being globally. So I think that the push to diversify is something that's going to influence a lot what is going to happen in the next years to go. In terms of competencies, I believe that the traditional competencies are still very relevant. Resilience is something that we are not going to change it. This is more than ever. You need to bring it. But one thing that we should be careful not to get away is the passion for why people actually get into the humanitarian. It's something that you also have to bring your passion with. It helps. It helps you to get in to know what you want to do. You bring the skills, but without the passion of the delivery that you want to provide, it's hard to contextualize it. It's hard to actually even learn faster. So being able to keep that passion of why and what we are there to do I think this is something that we should continue advocating for, and people should have it and bring it. The skills, they're transferable skills, but you cannot transfer if you lack of passion of what you have to do. And this is something that we should always, for me, put and advocate for in the workforce, and also people who are coming in this workforce. Over.
Thank you, Boris. And Yves, your thoughts on the three questions?
Appreciate what's just been said. I think the two that have just been mentioned, resilience and passion, that's absolutely true. If we lose this, I think we lose the heart of what is in the humanitarian sector, really. In terms of key competencies, one that is obvious and is increasingly visible is communication. We live in a world where communication is faster. It's more diverse than it was in the past in terms of ways of communicating, and that's becoming a key competency. The other key competency is having analytical capacity. We can no longer have people who just do things without understanding where it fits into a wider system and understanding the environment where they operate. In terms of what is useful for people who want to start in the sector, I think for me there are two areas that are absolutely essential. One is security and safety. And the second one is behavior. And the reason for this is these two elements impact on the entire community. Every time we have a security incident or a safety incident, it's the entire community that is affected one way or another. And then we must realize that we are all ambassadors for the humanitarian community one way or another. So every time we have somebody who misbehaves, it's basically bad representation for the entire sector. So I think the two that are really, really important for me are security, safety, and the second one is behaviors, realizing that we are all ambassadors, and the way we behave really matters. And it's not only about individual or organization, it's the entire sector that can be affected, as we've seen not so long ago with some of the safeguarding issues. Where is the sector going? I think it's unfortunately growing. I'm saying unfortunately because it sadly reflects the growing humanitarian needs in the world, and that is not a good news. I think it's also getting more complex, and I expect it to become increasingly complex in the future. The localization agenda is really, really high, on one we need to work hard on one we need to accelerate. And then, where is the sector going? I think one of the things we need to promote more is more cooperation and less competition. We still see a lot of competition in the sector, both at individual levels and organization level. And if we want to make progress, we have to cooperate a lot more. And that's why the study is actually helpful, because if it helps reaching a common understanding of the human resources issues and competencies required, then having this common understanding helps us to move together rather than actually compete like we tend to do. And I'm not saying competition is not healthy. I think it can be healthy, but there are limits, and at times cooperation is better.
Thanks so much, Yves. Now, we'll have to keep this quite brief as we've reached the end of our time, but I would like to go around for very brief closing remarks. And in these panelists, if I could ask you to reflect briefly on as a sector or as individual organizations, how can we use the findings of this study to enhance humanitarian work? Or perhaps we can add the question, is there further research that you think should be done that would be useful in the same vein? So let's go first to Yves, as you were just speaking to this already, then to Keiko, Boris, and Virginie. So back to you, Yves.
Thanks. I think there are two things we will use the study for. One is we frequently review our competency framework, and we'll use some of the findings to review our competency framework. That's a bit selfish, I understand this. The second thing we'll do with the study is to take into account the findings when we are considering supporting initiatives such as certification processes, competency framework across organization on this kind of approaches. On just to clarify where we stand on this, I think we live in a world where humanitarian partners demand a lot from donors, and I think donors demand a lot also from partners, which is understandable. I think on many of these issues, what we expect is partners to take initiatives rather than actually expecting us to lead this necessarily. On this study will help us select what initiative we support on which ones are perhaps not as evidence-based as those who are supported with this kind of study.
Great, thanks, Yves. And to Keiko, your closing remarks on that.
Well, I think these findings are really interesting. They provide us very good guidance, let's say, to identify and analyze the gaps that our organization are facing in terms of professional development and personal development also of our humanitarian workers. It also prioritizes somehow the trainings that we as organization need to put on the table, somehow offer to fill in the gaps that we can maybe identify from outside, like the sector candidates that would come from outside the sector too. And it is also a very good tool, in my personal opinion, for advocacy in terms of investment on the HR side, on the training, on the certification initiatives.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Keiko. And to Boris, your thoughts.
For me, it's such a milestone research and timely, so we can use this to rethink how we actually define humanitarian profession, how we identify and also train talent in general. I think it's really how we use it and how we interpret those outcomes is crucial for the future of the humanitarian workforce. It also gives us the opportunity to really think deeper about if humanitarian competencies or professions are really unique, as we say. I mean, this is really something we need to think about. And I think we have to think about it not only with our heart, because being a humanitarian, we usually love what we do and we want to continue doing it, and the heart is there. We need to be able to step back and see, what the data are really saying, and not to be clouded by what we want to see. And this is really important for the future of the function, if it is as a profession, and also how we continue attracting young, dynamic talent and continue delivering around the world. That's what I would really say.
Thank you, Boris. And Virginie, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'd say first that given the diversity of perspectives, which is reflected into the report, no matter what are the limitations described, I would say that for our organization, we should adopt coaching, individualized approach, both in terms of recruitment, in terms of strategy to retain our staff, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all approach. Also, given all the new competencies, not new competencies, but the way it's being presented, all those competencies and skills and so on, I would say that we also have to work with potential staff on their, I would define it as employability skills, like better prepare your CV, better prepare your interview and so on, because we're very far away from the general question of what are your strengths and weaknesses and that kind of thing. So staff have to be better prepared for interviews, I guess, as well for us to identify those skills. Given the clear importance which is being drawn on localization, both here in the chat, among the panelists, and in the report, I'd say that localized approach is definitely one of the takeaways of this report. And I would go even further. It should be a priority that we adopt a local to global approach when it comes to training. Local NGOs can train INGOs, and it should be a must, in fact, on the context as well. And then just picking up on the very relevant discussion on the chat, really importance of reiterating our core humanitarian values, referring here as well about the passion and why we are doing this specific kind of work and or volunteering. Two last information which were reflection which were more informed by my practice and the general perspective of the report. I would say that it would be interesting as well to have more info on specificities related to volunteers, because this is also something different from being a full-time staff, and we should value this. And another and very last point, I've been mentioning it, but I really think that the gender analysis of this report, even though reflected, should be really stronger if we really want to change the sector and our practices here.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our entire panel, to Yves, Keiko, Boris, Virginie. Really appreciate your inputs today. We've covered a lot of grounds, and it's really been an excellent discussion. So really thank you for taking the time to be with us and be part of today's conference. I'd now like to hand the floor over to Rory for a final exercise and looking at next steps. Over to you, Rory.
I think you have disconnected your audio. You need to click on the mic symbol on top of your screen.
I'm really sorry. I'm sorry. Is that okay now?
All good.
Okay, so yeah, thanks so much, Anna Howard, and thanks so much to all of you for that very stimulating conversation. I was just saying that I spent the last hour scribbling notes on lots of bits of paper on my desk because there's so much to take away from that. So what's next? This is the very first SOHP. This is the very first State of Humanitarian Professions study, and we've discovered together the wide range of interesting information it has generated. At Bioforce, we've already had some thoughts about whether to pursue this work in the future, and if so, how it might need to be improved. But we really want to use this unique opportunity to ask you what you think the next steps should be for the SOHP. So here we go. A few polls. It'll be very, very fast. So a few questions. The first question, very simple one. Yes or no, do you think that the work on SOHP, on the State of Humanitarian Professions, should be pursued in the future? So that's... Okay, thank you very much. I'll just leave a little bit more time for people to vote. Okay. Okay, so, well, that's extremely interesting. 96% at the moment, yes, 4% I'm not sure, and absolutely no one is saying it should not be pursued. So thank you very much for that. I think that's a clear message which we will keep. The second question, so if your answer was yes, which is 96% of you, how do you think the work should be pursued? So we're giving a few options here. First of all, do you think, and you can choose several options, okay? Should it be pursued by reiterating, by redoing the study every 3 to 5 years, for example, updating the study? Should it be pursued by setting up an ongoing observatory on humanitarian professions? or in any other form which you can specify. And you can, as I said, choose more than one option here. So at the moment, about a little under half of you are saying the study needs to be reiterated, and about over 80% saying that it'd be good to set up an ongoing observatory. And some of the other ideas, networking and spreading information. We have some recommendations about how it might be improved, which will be in the next question, actually. Provide recommendations to stakeholders, produce advocacy papers, etc., etc. So there seems to be a very, very strong interest in this idea of setting up an observatory, and then we have a nice long 23 ideas for other ways of pursuing this work. Thank you so much. One last question. Yet again, if your answer was yes, if you think this work should be pursued, what recommendations would you make to improve the work? So if we were to continue doing this work, and we've already, I think, in the conversations this morning, seen maybe some of its limitations, what recommendations would you make to improve this work? That's an open question. So the gender lens, yes, and that came out very, very clearly in the conversation. Yet again, as Charlie said, we can disaggregate various results in order to look at to disaggregate our results according to gender, local, international, etc. So that's something we'll be able to do with the results we already have. Research on passion, disillusionment, the issue of localization, yeah, a lot of the issues which we've been talking about this morning coming back up. Evolve more local NGOs, absolutely, thank you very much. Try to increase inputs of local NGOs and take into account gender. Okay, so we already have 34 recommendations. A number of them are, there are a few there which are quite, which are common. And so thank you very much for that. And we're going to take all of that and analyze it, and that will help us decide how we might be able to go on with this work. So thank you very, very much for all your encouragement, and your encouraging and great ideas. At Bioforce, we're going to do our best to pursue the work we've started on SOHP based on the results of the study, which we've started presenting to you today, and thanks to the promise of continued funding, which you heard from our donor today, and to all the input and recommendations that will come out of today's event. So watch this space. Thank you. Goodbye.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Rory. So now we've come to the end of this event. So just a few closing housekeeping points from our side. First of all, there have been several questions regarding a recording. Yes, there will be a recording of today's event, both in video and in audio-only podcast format. That will be available on the event page in the coming days. And also, following today's conference, the SOHP report will be finalized. So we're waiting until after the conference to really finalize the report, and then that will be shared shortly with all of the participants from today's event via email. So all conference participants who are here now will receive that soon by email. So with that, I'd like to once again thank everyone, panelists and participants, for some very interesting and rich discussions today. And I look forward to seeing some of you for the follow-up meeting, which is taking place at 2 p.m. today, Geneva time. So thanks again. Great to see all of the active engagement, and look forward to see some of you in a short time, and then the rest of you in a future event, I hope online or in person. Thanks so much. This is Anne Herod Lang signing off from Geneva.